This video examines the particularities of interest group politics in California. As your text mentions, interest groups in California are particularly strong. One way we can see this is in spending by interest group lobbyists to influence California state government decisions. Fortunately, California has some pretty strong lobbying transparency laws, so anyone seeking to influence government decisions must register and disclose their spending. This allows us to track who's spending money on lobbying activity in the state. And California accounts for 1/3 of all state-level lobbying in the entire country. That's a pretty good indicator of how active interest groups are at the state capitol. The California Secretary of State categorizes groups into 19 different types and tracks spending by each type. Government interest groups, for instance, Association of Counties or Water Districts, rank near the top with over $100 million in spending in the 2017 through 2018 legislative session. After the passage of Proposition 13, local government revenue through property taxes became much more limited. That fueled a competition for funds by local governments appealing to Sacramento for help. John Quimby, a lobbyist for San Bernardino County, summed up the situation when he said, "I wish government wasn't for sale like this, but the fact is you have to hustle to get your share. Local governments without lobbyists see the ones with representation doing better, so they say, we need to get our butts on board and get one, or they're going to steal everything from us." In addition to this kind of intense lobbying competition by local government, other industries and professions with heavy state government policy involvement like health, utilities, and education all rank very highly with tens of millions of dollars spent on lobbying. Over the years, California has tried to limit the influence of interest groups by placing a number of regulations on campaign finance. The idea is to try to limit the potential corrupting effect that wealthy interests can have on the government process if they can essentially buy elections for public officials. So limits have been put into place ranging from $4,700 in individual and PAC contributions to state legislative candidates to $31,000 for candidates for governor. In other words, these limits are the maximum size of a check you can cut as an individual or as an interest group PAC to support a particular candidate. The contributions to support or defeat ballot initiatives are unlimited, as are contributions to political parties. And super PACs face no limits in the amount that they can spend in independent expenditure campaigns. So these limits have done very little to slow the enormous growth rate of campaign spending in California politics. Campaign finance is big business in California. In the 2018 elections, over $1.4 billion was spent on California election campaigns. The largest chunk was the $573 million spent by the various candidates for office. But huge sums of money were also spent on ballot initiatives and independent expenditures by interest group super PACs. And the overwhelming majority of this money, 91%, was contributed by interest groups and parties. But parties also receive most of their funds from interest groups. Only a very small share of the money used to finance political campaigns in California comes from donations made by individual, ordinary citizens. This gives interest groups enormous sway in government and shows the truth in a statement made decades ago by the author Kerry McWilliams when he stated that interests, not people, are represented in Sacramento. Sacramento is the marketplace of California, where grape growers and sardine fishermen, morticians and osteopaths bid for allotments of state power. As your text notes, there seems to be an inverse relationship between the strength of interest groups and political parties in a given state. And because of the progressive reforms implemented in the early 20th century, California has quite weak parties. Parties can't control the nomination process because California has adopted an open primary system in which the top two vote getters in the primary regardless of party, advance to the general election. Local elections in California are almost entirely nonpartisan contests. Voters are less and less likely to register with a party and not very likely to give money to parties. So parties have relatively few resources at their disposal. The politicians still need money, staff resources, and mobilization support through things like endorsements in order to win election. And since they can't find those things in party organizations, more and more they've been turning to interest groups for those resources. Additionally, California instituted term limits on state legislators in the last couple decades, meaning there's a higher turnover rate among politicians in Sacramento. In one sense, this is a good thing, as voters have pretty clearly expressed their preference not to have entrenched politicians who accumulate power and remain in office indefinitely. But the downside is that the constant turnover of state legislators means elected officials are almost always learning the ropes, while the real institutional knowledge, the knowledge of how things work and how to get things done, resides with the interest groups who stick around year after year as different politicians come and go. This gives interest groups a huge informational advantage in their dealings with government. And finally, the initiative process allows interest groups to take their issues directly to the voters if they feel stymied by government in Sacramento. To wrap up our understanding of interest group politics in California, I'd like to focus on a single issue: regulation of charter schools, as an example of how policymaking in the state is largely determined by interest groups. California recently passed Assembly Bill 1505, which places certain regulations on charter schools and makes it somewhat easier for local school districts to deny a charter. This bill represented an agreement between competing interest groups, especially the California Teachers Association and the California Charter Schools Association. I've included resources in the module for you to examine this case in a little bit of detail. As you read about it, please consider whether you think this represents a good government decision-making process or a somewhat flawed process. In other words, does it make sense to resolve public issues like this by having the major groups with a stake in the policy dispute to negotiate a solution in conjunction with elected leaders? Or might there be problems with this approach? Are there any interests that get left out of the decision-making process? Consider those questions as you read more about AB 1505.